Hello, and welcome to Castle for One Games. I am George Castle, and today I'll be covering the solo rules for Genotype, designed by John Cavu, Paul Solomon, and Ian Zhang. This is a 1 to 5 player game, but today I'll be providing a tutorial of the Automa mode, which is a simulated opponent by the name of Brother Johann, an administrator at the monastery. Basically, we just want to end up with more points than Brother Johann by the end of the game, so we can take over Johann's responsibilities and run the monastery ourselves. Because that's the fun thing to do in the 19th century. It's equivalent to running a drive-in movie theater in today's modern times. So let's start with the setup. Johann gets 3 of the action markers and 3 research markers. He also gets 1 coin. We draw 2 pea plant cards, which will be placed in his garden area, forming a column. Then have a 9-card Automa deck shuffled, face down, ready to go. Now, depending on the level you want to play, easy, standard, or hard mode will depend on whether Johann will get an assistant at the start of the game. Check out the last page of the rulebook for an explanation of just how these assistants will be helping Brother Johann during that hard mode. For this tutorial, however, we will assume that Johann is playing the standard mode, but I'll reference some differences throughout the tutorial. So we're going to start by referencing the back of the book. It actually tells you the different steps throughout the game. The only difference is we will be adding an Automa maintenance phase that follows the working phase. Alright, now on to the working phase. Since both of you will start with 3 action markers, you each get 3 turns to place them on the board, or in our case, we also get to place them on a gardening player board. Now, since the Automa doesn't get a player board, it'll work a little bit differently, and we'll go through that in a little bit. The player always starts first, so you get to hold this neat shovel pretty much throughout the entire game. It is now time for Johann, and where he places his markers depends on the Automa cards he draws. As you draw the cards, you will start to form 2 stacks. And that's because he will draw 1 stack to the left, called the action card. And because this is the working phase, all of his actions are determined by the upper right hand corner of these cards. Just to clarify, all other areas of these action cards are only referenced in other phases. Then a second card is drawn and placed to the right, which is considered the support card. And this forms the decision types for its actions. And we will mostly be focusing on the right-hand bottom corner of the support card. Just to clarify, all other areas of these support cards are only referenced in other phases. Let's start with the treasury action card. And a dry support card, lowercase f. The AI will place the marker here, and Johann will gain 2 coins. Now, you may have noticed that it really didn't need a support card to determine which decision it would take for that particular action. I mean, you either place it here or you don't. However, it's a good habit to always draw one anyway, since there may be instances where the AI may not be able to perform an action, and will have to replace the action card and rely on that same support card. So for example, I already have a marker placed here, so Johann has to pick a different action. Johann will now have to draw another card, and it will continue to reference the original support card you drew. And it will continue to draw new action cards until there is an action it can perform. Also, you don't have to memorize this, but it's good to be aware. Anything that the Automa draws with a lowercase is considered, for all intent and purposes, a recessive gene. And any uppercase letters would be considered a dominant gene trait, and those will become more relevant as we continue through this tutorial. Next, let's assume that he draws the nursery action card. Since you are allowed to take 2 P cards from the nursery market, as indicated here, the AI will always take 2. In order to know which ones he will take, we will need to rely on the support card, and based on the support card drawn, the right corner pip highlighted under the gene trait letter indicates it will be the middle card. Now, the first card that he takes is always added to his garden and always placed on top of the column of active P cards. Now, if that column was full, in other words, he had a maximum of 4 cards, then he would validate instead. And validating a trait means that it will pick the first available or uncovered trait, starting from the bottom and working your way up until you find one available, and then you will cover it with a leaf. The next card he takes will be discarded, and it always takes the card to the right of the card he previously took, and it's just added to the discard pile. So what happens if there are no cards to take from the right? Well, it will wrap around and take the card to the left. Now, in this scenario, let's say that there's only 1 card left in the market. It will take that 1 card from the market to its garden and discard one from the top of the deck. Also, keep in mind that if Johan ever completes a P card at any time during his turn, he gets to harvest it immediately. It doesn't have to wait to perform a gardening action like a player does. He gets to harvest it right away. So make sure to move the remaining cards down to make room for more P cards in the future turns. So for any completed P cards, I set aside to be counted at the end of the game. I like to create a separate stack here. All right, in my next scenario, Johan draws an action card that allows him to set a research goal. In other words, he gets to place one of his research markers in any of the spaces available, as long as he can afford it. As you can see here, there is a cost of 2 coins for the first player that uses the space, and then 3 coins for the second player if they use this one. Assuming he can afford it, we place one of the research markers to the spot matching the support card trait that was drawn, just as we had discussed during the last part of the treasury action section of this video. In this case, the support card is a small g, so we will place it on this space, which is the recessive pod color, allowing him the opportunity to score more points for any of his completed P cards that he has been accumulating throughout the game that match that trait. If they had drawn a big G, it would be going into the dominant phenotype here for green. Again, if Johan didn't have any money, he would have to draw a new action card while keeping that support card that was drawn. Next, Johan draws a tool shed action card and will place his next worker there. This action card has 2 parts to it. First, we will remove a tool card from the tool shed. Since it only allows you to take 1 card from the market, it will be just that one. Again, we will have to reference the support card to know which one. In this case, the support card, big G, highlights the middle pip, which means it would take this card from the market. If that one was empty, it would go to the one on the right. And if that one was empty, it will wrap around and take this one instead. Remember, the pips just tell you where to start. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will be that one that will be taken. The second part of this action is that Johan will get to validate a trait from a pea plant card in his garden. And remember, validating means you will have to place a leaf on top of the first available trait. So start from the bottom and work your way up. Again, if it fills up one of his pea plant cards, it will be harvested right away and saved on his stack, to be counted at the end of the game. Next, we will talk about the first shift action card. This means that Johan will place one of its action markers on any one of these first shift spaces from this column on the board, as long as I haven't already placed one there, that is. But assuming there is one available, it will reference the trait letter of the support card to know which one of these it will use. In this case, Johan draws a support card with a mutation X symbol on the bottom right corner, and anytime this card comes out, you simply reference the action card, not the support card, to determine its decision. And in this example, it would be a capital G, so it will place its first shift under the green area. And just like the player, if you place an action marker here, it will receive a coin as well, if one is still available, that is. Our next example is the gardening action. Now keep in mind, this also has 2 parts to the action. Johan draws a support card with the lowercase g as the trait letter. Although he doesn't actually need to reference any support cards to perform this particular action, we still want to draw one anyway for the reasons we had mentioned before during the treasury action. Also, it's a good idea to add the action marker onto the card itself to kind of remind yourself where Johann spent one of his action markers during the working phase. You can also set aside the card so you can continue to draw more cards throughout the game. The first part of this action will allow Johann to validate each available trait he has on his plant cards, depending on how many assistants he has acquired so far in the game. In this example, he has 2 assistants, so he will be able to validate up to 2 available traits. If he had no assistants, then he would simply just skip the part of the action. So he will cover this one and this one. After Johann has completed the validation part, he will move on to the second part of this action by adding a new plant card. So he'll draw a plant card from the top of the deck, and then he must set it on top of his column. If his column was full, as it's mentioned in the cardinal rule, he's only allowed to have a maximum of 4 plant cards on his column at any time. He would then just get another chance to validate another trait instead. Now, on a side note, don't make the same mistake I made in thinking that I would add more P-plant cards based on how many plots he has acquired so far. This only happens during the maintenance phase, so for this action, he will only ever gain just 1. Alright, so now in my next example, Johann draws a university action. Then he draws a support card with the capital T, but for this action, however, he does not need to reference it, which is just to place one of his workers in this space, as long as he has coins to spend it. He simply places one of his markers and validates an available trait from his plant cards, starting from the bottom and working his way up to the next available trait. If Johann did not have any coins, or the space was already used and couldn't afford the other space, then the AI would simply draw a new action card and keep the same support card. In my next example, Johann draws an action card to change a parent gene tile. In this example, he'll be changing the one on the left of one of the Punnett squares. And since he drew the support card with the uppercase F gene trait letter, it means that Johann will be placing his marker in the red area, the flower color Punnett square. And since in this example there are no markers in this space, we'll go ahead and add his marker. Now we add the vertical parent gene tile here, and since there is still an unclaimed coin, he will also get that coin. Now if there would have already been a tile there, then he would simply remove it from the board, but still gets the coin. Now if there was already an action marker there, then Johann will just have to redraw a new action card. In this next example, Johann draws another parent gene tile, but this time he wants to change the top side of the blue Punnett square for the dominant R. So we'll add his marker here and add the horizontal tile. The coin was already taken when I placed my marker earlier on the first shift space, so Johann will not be able to collect a coin this turn. Now, of course, if there's already a tile there, like on this one, then he would simply remove it instead. Now, on a side note, as you can see, these parent gene tiles are specifically made in sets so that you could easily flip them back and forth and adjust them. So it's easier to read vertically or horizontally. Alright, once the working phase is complete, you will move on to what the game calls the Automa Phase, or as I like to refer it, the maintenance phase. We will be looking at this reference card provided by the game. First thing we do is check if Johann has placed any of his action markers on any of these first shift spaces during the working phase. Well, he basically just used that first shift space for coins or to block me from going there. Now, if there are multiple markers, then he will continue to add them on the second shift spaces. Next, we check to see if he has hired any assistants from any past upgrade phases we've played before. And based on how many he has, that's how many traits he can validate. In this example, the AI has 2 assistants, so he will validate up to 2 traits. Again, starting from the bottom, working your way up until you see one that's available. Then we draw 1 P-plant card and add it to his garden. Plus, you add as many more P-plant cards as he has plot tiles, which he has been purchasing throughout the game. Since he only has one so far, he will add this one as well for a total of 4 pea plant cards in his garden. In this scenario, the AI already has 4 pea plant cards in his garden. He has reached the maximum allowed. So because he adds one during the Automa phase, plus the one for his existing plot tile, the 2 plant cards that he would have drawn instead will now get to validate twice. Again, from the bottom, work your way up. Now, if he had 2 plots instead, then he would have validated 3, and so on. All right, now, depending on the level of difficulty that you're playing, as you can see from this section of the reference card, it indicates that the standard or hard mode, Johann will receive 3 coins. But if you're playing the easy mode, he doesn't receive any coins. And lastly, this section here indicates that he will shuffle all of the Automa cards, regardless if they have already been played or not. Now, before we move on to the plant breeding phase, let's discuss what turn order and these shifts really mean with the Automa. The first thing we have to consider is that any markers placed in the first shift spaces are pretty much just from the player. There wouldn't be any from the AI because remember, he always moves down to the second shift area during the Automa maintenance phase anyway, which we just covered. So what's the advantage for us going for each of these areas first? Well, you get the first opportunity to select the dice from that specific area, especially if you need it for one of your traits. Now, this is done before we have rolled the dice, so we still won't know what's coming out, but it does increase your chances of getting what you need before the AI. And you get to go first before we even consider regular turn order, which who goes first in regular turn order? You do. Which means you could end up with multiple turns before the AI even gets a chance to choose a die, even if he does have multiple second shift workers. Now, if we don't have any first shift markers placed, then we would have to consider any markers on the second shift before we start regular turn order. So if the AI has a marker or multiple markers, it will go first before regular turn order. In other words, before your turn. And while yes, you could have selected to place one of your markers here as well, the only difference is that you would have to give up a turn, whereas Johann just gets to do it for free. Now, this could be a good or bad strategy depending on how many action turns you're willing to sacrifice, because you could be missing out on other benefits. For example, treasury, or gaining additional pea plant cards, etc. So there is a trade-off to consider for this type of turn order. Now, after we've gone through these 2 shifts, we go back to the regular turn order as I mentioned, which is back to the player going first. All right, now let's move on to the plant breeding phase. After we roll the dice, we check to see if there are any markers in the first shift spaces and any in the second shift, as we just discussed during the turn order section. The player always starts first after the first and second turn orders are completed. Once the player takes his or her turn, we will draw the Automa card for each turn the AI has. All right, and in this example, we draw the first Automa card, and we always start by placing it next to the card located on the top of the column, and working our way down to the next available card throughout each turn. And this time, we're focused on the arrows from the Automa cards. We no longer care about anything else on the cards, just the arrows. And we will talk about what this yellow dice means with the mutation symbol in just a little bit. But for now, understand that the arrows indicate which dice the AI will be looking for that match the plant card trait that it's pointing to. In this case, it's a value 12 plant card. The top arrow is pointing to 2 big R's, meaning the dominant seed shape. However, notice that it's actually a double arrow. That means that it will remove 2 matching dice off the board, if there are 2. If not, it will remove at least 1. Now, even though it removed 2 dice, it will still only validate 1 of them. The other one is just simply discarded. This is meant to add tension to the game, like a higher count. Now, during the same turn, we will also try to validate the next trait with a single arrow, pointing to the big and small f, meaning the dominant flower color. And since there is a matching die, it will remove a single die. Then, validate that trait. and I just like to place all of his dice off to the side of the board until the next round. So what if it points to an empty space? Well, it skips that arrow and moves to the next one. And if they were both pointing to an empty space, then it would skip that turn altogether. And if it had pointed to a trait that already had a leaf, it would skip that arrow. If there are no dice to this double T trait that it's pointing to, then it will skip that arrow. Basically, it just skipped the entire turn for this card. Remember that Automa card with a yellow die and a mutant symbol that I had drawn earlier? Well, there's one of that type for each colored dice. And if you happen to draw one of them, it means that you will check to see if there are any dice in the de novo mutation spaces matching that color. In this value 7 plant card, it checks for the flower color, but there isn't one, so it will end its turn. On its next turn, it draws for this value 9 plant card. And this time there is one, so the AI will take a die and it acts as a wild trait. So it will validate any trait on their garden that has a letter R. Regardless of the type of R, we'll look for a matching trait starting from the bottom and working our way up. And in this case, it will validate a double R recessive trait for that card. So what if there are no matches or available traits? Then the AI will choose to just gain a coin instead. Now remember, you can also choose a mutated trait die from the de novo mutation space, if there was one. However, the player has to take a second die with it, even if it's another mutation die from the de novo space. So it will fill up at least 2 of your die spaces. And when Johann does it, he doesn't have to worry about that, since he only takes that one mutation die. He doesn't have to take any accompanying die. Besides, he doesn't have the dice space limitations anyway. So as you can see, there will always be times where the AI will skip its turn completely, or other times it will validate up to 3 times in one card, like this value 13 card. Alright, let's go over the dice slots. Typically the plant breeding phase happens in just 3 turns, going back and forth until all turns are taken. However, if either of you has any dice slots that were purchased during the research phase, then both of you will have more opportunities to select additional dice. Now, in this scenario, the AI has 3 pea plant cards available in his garden, and he has 1 dice slot. That means he will have up to 4 opportunities to select dice, which means you will have to draw up to 4 Automa cards to see if it can validate any of his traits. So for this example, it means that the top card will have a second opportunity to see if it validates one of its traits, since you always loop back to the top of the column. Once all the turns have been completed, we move to the research upgrade phase. Okay, we have reached the research upgrade phase. In this case, it's basically always going to be the AI first, because regardless of first shift or second shift, the regular turn order always remains player first, then the AI. And in the research phase, it gets flipped, with the last person going first, always, which means Johann. So how the AI determines which of the upgrades to purchase will depend on 2 things. How much money does it currently have, and which upgrade is the double arrow pointing to. And in this example, the AI is pointing to hire an assistant upgrade, and its current cost is 3 coins. And currently the AI has 4 coins available, so it will be able to purchase the assistant matching the pit position from the bottom corner of the Automa card you just drew. Take that card and place it on his playing area, face down, because it only uses them for validations anyway. Now, it's back to you to purchase if you have any money. Then, after your turn is complete, it will go back to the AI if you're playing standard or hard mode. If not, you may continue purchasing until you run out of money. Since we are reviewing the standard mode in this tutorial, then the turn is back to Johann. However, since the only upgrade he can afford is a new plot, we won't need to draw any cards. Just give him the upgrade and let him spend his money. Alright, we now move to the end of round reset. We're going to advance the round marker, I think it's a stopwatch, to the next round. We don't have to worry about passing the player marker because, well, you probably guessed it, we're always first in turn. We then reduce each of the upgrades in the abacus marker prices 1 coin in cost. We will refresh the pea plant market or nursery area. And then we're going to refresh the tool cards from the tool shed. Any remaining assistants get reset. And then we're going to make sure to add any coins to any of the Punnett square areas that are empty. We then recover all of the action markers. We return all of the offspring dice from the board. And the difference with the solo mode is that you need to reshuffle that Automa card to get ready for the next round. All right, we have reached the end of the game, and we're going to go through the scoring phase. And the game ends as normal. After the final plant breeding phase, you should not continue on to the research upgrade phase at this point. You just need to move the round tracker to the space called Harvest. And at this point is when we would get to harvest all the completed pea plant cards, if you have any, without having to worry about any gardening actions. Of course, the Automa should not have any completed pea plant cards at this point, because it has been harvesting automatically as soon as it fills up any of its cards throughout the game. Remember, it does not require a gardening action to have to do this for the AI. We now check to see the point value of each of our completed or harvested pea plant cards, both from the AI and from our own. We then move on to the phenotype research goals and check to see if anyone has placed any of their markers on the board. We compare those to all the traits on our completed pea plant cards and multiply those points. In this example, I have placed one of my research markers on the dominant green color pod. That means that for any big double G's or one big G, one small g that I have harvested, we'll get to multiply 2 points for each of them. And I have 2 cards harvested, so that will bring it to a total of 4 points. And then we check all of our incomplete research from each of the pea plant cards still standing. And we get 1 point per trait, or leaf. Here, Johann has 3. And finally, we check to see how many unspent coins we have left. We then total the scores, and whoever has the most points wins. But that's it for me. Until our next board game adventure, hope you had a great time with this one.